Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of Silver Wings Private Aviation Terminal, her Louis Vuitton carry-on gripped tightly in her right hand. The morning sun reflected off the terminal's glass windows, and she could see several private jets parked on the tarmac. As one of Boston's top neurosurgeons, she had grown accustomed to chartered flights, but something felt different today. She checked her Apple Watch, 7:45 a.m. The medical conference in Chicago started at 2 p.m., and she was scheduled to be the keynote speaker. Her presentation on groundbreaking brain surgery techniques was safely stored in her laptop bag, along with all her travel documents. The terminal's automatic doors slid open, releasing a burst of cool air. The lobby was quiet, with only a few early morning travelers seated in the plush leather chairs. A young couple dressed in business attire walked past her, nodding politely. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the exclusive waiting lounge. Sarah approached the security desk, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Behind the desk sat Thomas Cooper, a middle-aged security guard with graying hair and a stern expression. He was busy checking something on his computer screen, deliberately taking his time before looking up. "Good morning," Sarah said, placing her documents on the counter. "I have a 9 a.m. flight to Chicago." Cooper finally raised his eyes, and Sarah noticed the immediate change in his expression. His previously neutral face hardened, and his eyes narrowed slightly. He picked up her papers with what seemed like reluctance. "Purpose of travel?" he asked, his tone notably different from the friendly way he had greeted the couple before her. "I'm speaking at the International Neurosurgery Conference," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional composure. She had encountered such behavior before: the supple shifts in expression, the unnecessary questioning, the underlying doubt. Cooper began typing into his computer, much slower than necessary. "This booking seems unusual," he said, though everything was clearly marked in her documentation. "Are you sure you're at the right terminal?" Sarah took a deep breath. After 15 years as a surgeon and countless similar experiences, she knew exactly what was happening. "Yes, I'm certain. The booking was made through my hospital's executive travel department. Everything should be in order." She watched as Cooper made a show of scrutinizing every detail of her paperwork. Through the corner of her eye, she could see other passengers being waved through with barely a glance at their documents. The young couple from earlier was already heading toward the security checkpoint. "I'll need to make some calls to verify this," Cooper announced, reaching for his phone. "These credentials, they seem a bit... well, we need to be thorough." Sarah glanced at her watch again, 8 a.m. She had planned to review her presentation in the lounge before the flight. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" she asked calmly, though her heart was beginning to race. "Ma'am, we have procedures we need to follow," Cooper replied, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. "Private aviation requires strict security protocols." Just then, Sarah felt her phone vibrate. It was a text from Dr. James Wilson, her colleague. "Break a leg at the conference. Your research will change lives." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, about to present revolutionary medical techniques that could help anyone, regardless of their race, yet she was being blocked because of her skin color. She noticed a few other travelers watching the scene unfold. An older businessman in an expensive suit frowned as he observed the interaction. A flight attendant behind the coffee counter had stopped wiping the counter, her attention drawn to the developing situation. Sarah straightened her spine and pulled out her hospital ID card, the one showing her position as head of neurosurgery at Boston Memorial. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I understand you're doing your job. However, I've provided all the required documentation. My credentials are valid, my flight is booked and paid for, and I have a conference to attend." Cooper's face remained impassive as he picked up her hospital ID, studying it as if it were written in hieroglyphics. The terminal's atmosphere had grown tense, with more people beginning to notice the unusual delay at the security desk. Sarah knew this moment would define the rest of her day, perhaps even more than her conference presentation. She had two choices: let anger take over, or handle this with the same precision and patience she used in the operating room. As always, she chose the latter. Little did she know, her response to this moment would set in motion changes that would reach far beyond this morning's confrontation. Cooper's unnecessary verification calls stretched into minutes. The clock on the wall showed 8:15 a.m., and Sarah could feel her carefully planned schedule slipping away. She watched as 3 more passengers breezed through security without any extra scrutiny. None of them looked like her. "I'm sorry, but something seems irregular with this booking," Cooper said, though he hadn't actually made any real calls yet. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable flying commercial." His suggestion carried a clear message: you don't belong here. Sarah pulled out her phone and, without making it obvious, started recording. Years of dealing with similar situations had taught her to document everything. She pressed the record button just as Cooper began his next round of questioning. "How exactly did you afford this private charter?" he asked, leaning forward with narrowed eyes. "These flights are quite expensive." The implied accusation hung heavy in the air. Before Sarah could respond, a voice spoke up behind her. "Is there a problem here?" She turned to see the older businessman she'd noticed earlier. His name tag identified him as Richard Palmer, Executive Vice President of Atlantic Airways. "No problem, sir," Cooper replied quickly, his tone shifting to something more professional. "Just conducting standard security checks." "Standard?" Palmer raised an eyebrow. "I've been flying through this terminal for 15 years, and I've never seen a standard check take this long." He turned to Sarah. "I'd apologize for overhearing, but did he just ask how you could afford your flight?" Sarah nodded, maintaining her composure. "Yes, among other questions that seem unique to me." By now, a small crowd had gathered. The young couple from earlier had stopped their walk to the gate. The flight attendant had moved closer, coffee pot still in hand. Even the janitor had paused his morning cleaning routine to watch. "Mr. Cooper," Palmer said firmly, "I heard this lady mention she's a neurosurgeon heading to a conference. My wife had brain surgery last year. Perhaps you'd like to know that the technique used to save her life was developed by Dr. Sarah Mitchell." He pointed to Sarah's hospital ID still lying on the counter. "The same Dr. Mitchell you're currently harassing." Cooper's face reddened. He looked down at the ID again, then at his computer screen. The terminal had grown so quiet that Sarah could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. I still need to verify," Cooper stammered, but his voice had lost its previous authority. "Then verify," Sarah said calmly, placing her phone on the counter, the recording still running. "But please explain exactly what you're verifying and why. And while you're at it, perhaps you could explain why the last 7 passengers didn't require such thorough verification." A woman in a crisp business suit emerged from a side office, drawn by the commotion. Her badge identified her as Maria Torres, terminal manager. "What's going on here?" she asked, taking in the scene. "Your security officer seems to have concerns about my documentation," Sarah explained, her voice steady, "though I'm having trouble understanding exactly what those concerns are." Maria glanced at the documents on the counter, then at Cooper's flustered face, and quickly assessed the situation. She had seen this before, too many times. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, picking up the papers, "I see nothing irregular here. Your booking is fully verified, your credentials are impeccable, and," she paused, looking directly at Cooper, "there is absolutely no reason for any additional checks." Cooper's face had turned from red to pale. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for Sarah's documents. "However," Maria continued, "I would very much appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to file an incident report. We take these situations very seriously." Sarah looked at her watch again, 8:30 a.m. Her flight wasn't until 9 a.m., and suddenly, documenting this incident seemed more important than reviewing her presentation one more time. "Of course," she replied, picking up her phone and stopping the recording. "I think it's important to address these standard security checks thoroughly." As she followed Maria toward her office, Sarah could feel Cooper's eyes on her back. She heard Richard Palmer saying something about unacceptable behavior and formal complaints. The young couple shook their heads in disgust as they finally proceeded to their gate. This wasn't the morning Sarah had planned. Perhaps it was the morning that needed to happen. Inside Maria Torres's office, Sarah sat in a comfortable leather chair, her carry-on placed neatly beside her. The terminal manager's office was warm and professional, with large windows overlooking the runway where private jets gleamed in the morning sun. "Dr. Mitchell," Maria began, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Please tell me exactly what happened this morning." Her face showed genuine concern and a hint of embarrassment about the incident. Sarah recounted the events calmly, her voice never wavering. As she spoke, she connected her phone to Maria's computer and transferred the recording. The audio played clearly through the office speakers, capturing every subtle tone in Cooper's voice, every discriminatory question he had asked. "I have to ask," Maria said, pausing the recording, "would you be willing to use this as part of our staff training? Your composure in handling this situation was remarkable." Before Sarah could answer, there was a knock at the office door. Richard Palmer, the airline executive who had spoken up earlier, stood in the doorway. "I apologize for interrupting," he said, "but I felt I needed to be part of this conversation." He entered the office and took a seat next to Sarah. "What happened out there was unacceptable, and as someone who frequently uses this terminal, I want to ensure changes are made." Maria nodded, typing quickly on her keyboard. "Mr. Cooper has been placed on immediate administrative leave," she explained. "But I think we all know this is about more than one security guard." Sarah looked between them both. The support was encouraging, but she had seen too many incidents end with temporary solutions. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "Actually," Maria replied, "we'd like to hear your thoughts. You handled this situation with such grace and professionalism. How would you address these issues if you were in my position?" Sarah took a deep breath. She hadn't expected to give 2 presentations today, but this one might be even more important than her medical conference. "First," she began, "we need to acknowledge that this isn't about punishing Mr. Cooper. It's about changing mindsets." She reached into her laptop bag and pulled out a small notebook. "While I was sitting at that security desk, I noticed several things." She opened the notebook and started listing her observations. How Cooper's behavior changed based on passengers' appearances, how other staff members seemed uncomfortable but unsure how to intervene, how the system itself allowed for such discriminatory practices. Richard Palmer leaned forward, clearly impressed. "You are documenting all of this while being harassed?" "As a black woman in medicine, I've learned to pay attention to patterns," Sarah explained. "The same biases I face at this terminal exist in hospitals, boardrooms, and countless other places. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Maria stopped typing and looked directly at Sarah. "What would you suggest?" "Comprehensive bias training is important," Sarah said, "but it's not enough. You need clear protocols that leave no room for individual prejudices. Every security check should follow the same steps, documented electronically. Any deviation should require supervisor approval and explanation." She continued outlining her ideas: regular audits of security interactions, anonymous feedback systems for passengers, diversity in hiring practices, and most importantly, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. As she spoke, both Maria and Richard took notes. The office felt charged with possibility, the potential for real change growing with each suggestion. "Dr. Mitchell," Richard said finally, "would you consider being part of this change? We could use your expertise in developing these programs." Sarah glanced at her watch. 8:45 a.m. Her flight to Chicago would be boarding soon. "I have a conference to attend today," she said, "but I'm willing to help however I can. This is too important to ignore." Maria stood up and extended her hand. "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, not just for these suggestions, but for showing us how to handle discrimination with dignity. Your response today will help create lasting change." As Sarah gathered her belongings to head to her gate, she felt a mix of emotions. The morning had been challenging, but something positive was emerging from it. Sometimes, she thought, the most important surgeries weren't performed in an operating room. They were the precise, careful operations that removed the tumors of prejudice from society's systems. She walked toward her gate, head held high, knowing that her experience today might make tomorrow easier for someone else. Walking toward her gate, Sarah noticed the atmosphere in the terminal had shifted. The same passengers who had witnessed the incident were now looking at her with a mixture of respect and admiration. The young couple she had seen earlier approached her as she reached the private lounge. "Dr. Mitchell," the woman said softly. "I'm Dr. Jessica Chen, and this is my husband, Dr. Mark Chen. We're also headed to the neurosurgery conference." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What we just witnessed out there, it happens more often than people want to admit." Sarah nodded, recognizing a shared understanding in Jessica's eyes. As they entered the luxurious waiting area together, Mark spoke up. We've read your research on minimally invasive brain surgery techniques. It's revolutionary. But what you did out there today might be even more important. The lounge attendant, a young woman named Tracy, hurried over with a cup of coffee. Dr. Mitchell, this is our special blend. On the house. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the cup. I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier at the security desk. I should have said something. Thank you, Tracy, Sarah replied, accepting the coffee. Sometimes it's hard to know what to do in these situations. That's why we need better systems in place. She took a sip of the coffee, appreciating its rich flavor. The comfortable lounge, with its leather seats and panoramic views of the runway, was now filling up with more passengers. Word of the incident had spread quickly. Sarah could hear snippets of conversations around her, people discussing what they had witnessed. An elderly gentleman in a pilot's uniform approached their small group. Dr. Mitchell? I'm Captain James Rodriguez. I'll be flying your charter to Chicago today. He smiled warmly. I heard what happened. Just want you to know that in my 30 years of flying, some of the most accomplished passengers I've had the privilege to transport have been people who look like you and me. Sarah checked her presentation slides on her laptop while chatting with the Chens about the upcoming conference. Jessica shared her own experiences as an Asian woman in medicine, and Mark talked about his observations as someone who had witnessed his wife face subtle discrimination. At 8:55 a.m., the boarding announcement came. As Sarah gathered her belongings, she noticed Maria Torres entering the lounge with a document in her hand. The terminal manager made her way directly to their group. Dr. Mitchell, before you board, I wanted you to have this, Maria said, handing her an official-looking letter. It's a formal apology from the terminal management, along with an outline of the immediate changes we're implementing based on your suggestions. Sarah scanned the document, impressed by the quick response. The letter detailed specific policy changes, mandatory recording of all security interactions, weekly diversity training sessions, and a new passenger feedback system. We've also arranged for your return flight to be complimentary, Maria added, though I know that doesn't make up for what happened. It's not about compensation, Sarah replied, folding the letter carefully into her bag. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As they walked toward the boarding gate, Sarah noticed something else had changed. The same security staff who had seemed uncertain earlier were now standing straighter, making eye contact, offering genuine smiles to every passenger regardless of their appearance. Captain Rodriguez led the way down the jet bridge, carrying Sarah's carry-on despite her protests. Jessica and Mark followed behind, all of them discussing their presentations for the conference. Just before boarding, Sarah took one last look back at the terminal. Through the large windows, she could see Maria talking to a group of security staff, likely already implementing some of the new policies. The morning's events had set something in motion that went beyond one incident, one security guard, or one passenger. As she settled into her comfortable seat on the private jet, Sarah finally allowed herself to relax. Her phone buzzed with a message from her hospital director. Just heard what happened at the terminal. You turned a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for change. That's why you're not just a great surgeon, but a great leader. Sarah smiled, looking out the window as the engine started up. Sometimes the most important victories didn't happen in operating rooms or conference halls, but in everyday moments where someone chose to stand up with dignity and grace. The plane began to taxi, carrying her toward Chicago, where another kind of presentation awaited. But she knew that her most important presentation of the day had already been given, not with slides and data, but with courage and composure. The flight to Chicago was smooth, giving Sarah time to reflect on the morning's events. As she reviewed her conference presentation on her laptop, her mind kept drifting back to Thomas Cooper's face, not the hostile expression he had worn initially, but the look of shame that had crossed his features when his prejudice was exposed. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, announcing they were halfway to Chicago. The Chens were seated across the aisle, Jessica typing rapidly on her tablet while Mark dozed beside her. Dr. Mitchell, Jessica called softly, looking up from her device. Your story is trending on social media. Someone in the terminal posted about what happened. Sarah pulled out her phone and saw several notifications. A video clip had been shared, filmed discreetly by one of the passengers, showing her calm response to Cooper's discrimination. The comments were overwhelming. This is how you handle prejudice with grace, And watch how she turned discrimination into education. I never wanted this to go viral, Sarah sighed, putting her phone away. She had focused on solving the problem, not creating a social media moment. The flight attendant, Lisa, appeared with fresh coffee. Dr. Mitchell, there's someone who'd like to speak with you when we land. The chief of security for the entire private aviation network was at another terminal this morning. He saw the video and is meeting us in Chicago. Sarah nodded, wondering how this story would continue to unfold. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Maria Torres. Mr. Cooper has asked to speak with you when you return. He wants to apologize personally. Jessica leaned across the aisle. Will you meet with him? Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. Change doesn't happen by shutting people out. It happens through difficult conversations. The plane began its descent into Chicago. Through the window, Sarah could see the gleaming skyline where, in a few hours, she would present her medical research. But now she had two presentations to think about, one about healing brains and another about healing hearts and minds. As they taxied to the private terminal at O'Hare International Airport, Sarah saw a small group waiting on the tarmac. Among them was a tall man in a security uniform with chief's insignia. After disembarking, Chief William Harris introduced himself. His handshake was firm, his expression serious. Dr. Mitchell, what happened this morning has made us realize we need systemic changes across our entire network. They walked into the terminal together, the Chens following close behind. In the private lounge, Chief Harris spread out documents on a table. We've been monitoring our security interactions for years, he explained, showing her statistics and reports. But we've never had someone document discrimination so clearly and handle it so effectively. Would you consider consulting with us on a national level? Sarah studied the papers before her. The data showed patterns she was all too familiar with. Minorities facing longer security checks, more random screenings, additional questioning. Chief Harris, she began, I'm a neurosurgeon. My job is to identify problems in complex systems and fix them precisely. The human brain and human prejudice aren't so different. Both require careful diagnosis and targeted treatment. She pulled out her notebook from earlier and shared her observations and suggestions. The chief listened intently, taking notes as she spoke about creating transparent protocols, establishing clear accountability measures, and implementing training that went beyond superficial diversity seminars. This isn't just about private aviation, Sarah explained. Every time someone faces discrimination in a professional setting, it reinforces the barriers that shouldn't exist. As they finished their discussion, Sarah checked the time. She had 45 minutes before her conference presentation. Chief Harris gathered his papers, standing to leave. Dr. Mitchell, he said, your presence here today was meant to be about sharing medical knowledge. Instead, you've given us an even more important lesson. Jessica, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. You know, Dr. Mitchell, you're performing two types of surgery today, one on the healthcare system through your research, and another on the aviation system through your advocacy. Sarah smiled, gathering her presentation materials. Sometimes the most important operations happened outside the operating room. As she prepared to leave for the conference, she thought about Cooper back in Boston, about the changes beginning to ripple through the aviation system, and about how one moment of courage could open doors for countless others. The morning's incident had been difficult, but it had planted seeds of change that would grow far beyond one terminal, one city, or one day. The International Neurosurgery Conference was packed with medical professionals from around the world. Sarah stood backstage in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Medical Center, preparing for her keynote speech. Her morning's experience at the airport felt like it had happened in another lifetime. Dr. James Wilson, her colleague from Boston Memorial, found her behind the curtain. Sarah, have you seen your phone? The video from the terminal has over 1 million views. You're trending on every major social media platform. Sarah took a deep breath, straightening her blazer. James, right now I need to focus on why we're really here, sharing our research that could save lives. The conference moderator's voice boomed through the speakers. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, head of neurosurgery at Boston Memorial Hospital. As Sarah walked onto the stage, the applause was different from what she usually experienced. She could see people in the audience holding up their phones, whispering to each other. They weren't just seeing a neurosurgeon. They were seeing the woman from the viral video. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "Today, I'm here to present our groundbreaking technique for minimally invasive brain surgery. But before I begin, I'd like to share something I learned this morning about treating invisible problems." The audience leaned forward, intrigued. Sarah hadn't planned to mention the airport incident, but suddenly it seemed relevant to her medical presentation. In neurosurgery, we often deal with invisible issues: tumors, clots, damaged neural pathways. We can't see them from the outside, but they affect everything. Similarly, bias and discrimination often lurk beneath the surface, invisible to some but painfully real to others. She clicked to her first slide, showing a complex brain scan. Just as we use advanced imaging to identify problems in the brain, we need sophisticated tools to identify problems in our society. And just as we develop precise surgical techniques to remove tumors without damaging surrounding tissue, we must learn to remove prejudice while preserving human dignity. The presentation room was silent, every person hanging on her words. Sarah moved smoothly into her medical research, explaining their new surgical technique with clarity and confidence. But she wove her morning's experience into the medical narrative, drawing powerful parallels between healing bodies and healing societies. As she concluded her presentation, the applause was thunderous. The cue and a session that followed surprised her. Questions weren't just about her surgical technique, but about her approach to handling discrimination, about creating change in established systems. Dr. Chen raised her hand from the front row. "Dr. Mitchell, how do you maintain such composure when facing discrimination, especially in professional settings?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I treat it like a complicated surgery. Rushing or responding with anger only causes more damage. Precision, patience, and a clear vision of the desired outcome, these are the tools we need, whether in the operating room or in life." After the presentation, Sarah's phone was flooded with messages. The terminal incident had sparked discussions across the country. Private aviation companies were reviewing their security protocols. Medical institutions were examining their own biases. In the conference hall, a young black medical student approached her with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Mitchell, watching you stand up to that security guard while maintaining your professionalism, it gave me hope. I faced similar situations during my clinical rotations." Sarah hugged the student, remembering her own struggles during medical school. "Remember," she said softly, "every time we handle discrimination with dignity, we make the path a little easier for those who come after us." Later that afternoon, between conference sessions, Sarah received another message from Maria Torres. "Mr. Cooper has been watching the video of his interaction with you all day. He's been sitting in my office crying. He keeps saying, 'I didn't see her, I only saw my prejudices.' Your composure didn't just expose his bias, it forced him to confront it." Sarah sat in a quiet corner of the conference center, reflecting on how her day had unfolded. She had come to Chicago to present a new way of performing brain surgery, but somehow she had ended up demonstrating a different kind of healing, the kind that happened in hearts and minds rather than in operating rooms. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Chief Harris. "Dr. Mitchell, your impact today goes far beyond medicine. Sometimes the most important surgeries don't involve a scalpel at all." 2 days later, Sarah returned to Boston's private aviation terminal. The atmosphere was noticeably different from her departure. Security staff stood straighter, made eye contact, and showed genuine respect to every passenger regardless of their appearance. Maria Torres met her at the entrance. "Dr. Mitchell, welcome back. We've been busy implementing changes while you were gone." She gestured toward a new electronic system at the security desk. "Every interaction is now recorded and monitored for consistency." But what caught Sarah's attention was Thomas Cooper, standing quietly in the corner of the terminal. He looked different, humbled, nervous, and much older than he had appeared 2 days ago. When he saw Sarah, he took a hesitant step forward. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice shaking. I've been waiting for your return. Would you have a moment to talk?" Sarah nodded, and Maria led them to a small conference room, the same room where, just days ago, Sarah had outlined her suggestions for change. Now it would host a different kind of conversation. Cooper sat down, his hands trembling slightly. "I've watched the video of our interaction hundreds of times," he began. "I've read every comment. But what really got to me was watching how you handled my prejudice. You could have gotten angry, could have demanded I be fired. Instead, you showed me dignity I didn't deserve. Sarah listened quietly as Cooper continued. His words came faster now, like a dam breaking. I grew up in a small town. Never really knew any successful black professionals. I carried those small-town prejudices with me, never questioning them. But watching you that day, your professionalism, your grace under pressure, it forced me to see myself clearly for the first time. Mr. Cooper, Sarah replied gently, recognition is the first step toward change. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote my resignation letter, but Miss Torres wouldn't accept it. Instead, she suggested I do something more meaningful. Maria stepped forward. We've asked Mr. Cooper to lead our new bias awareness program. Who better to speak about the damage of prejudice than someone who has confronted their own? Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. Cooper explained, I've spent the last 2 days studying diversity training programs, reading about unconscious bias, and most importantly, examining my own attitudes. I want to use my experience to help others recognize and change their prejudices. The hardest surgery we can perform, Sarah said thoughtfully, is the one we perform on ourselves, removing old beliefs, cutting away prejudices, healing old wounds. Cooper nodded, wiping tears from his eyes. My first training session is tomorrow. I'm starting with my own story, how it took a distinguished neurosurgeon's patience to make me see my own bias. A knock on the door interrupted them. Tracy, the lounge attendant, peeked in. Dr. Mitchell, there's someone here who'd like to meet you. A young black girl, maybe 12 years old, entered the room clutching a tablet. Dr. Mitchell, I saw your video. I want to be a doctor too, but some people at school said I couldn't. After watching how you handled that security guard, I know they're wrong. Sarah felt tears forming in her own eyes. She hugged the young girl, then turned to Cooper. This is why what we're doing matters. Every barrier we break down, every mind we open, creates possibility for someone else. Cooper stood up, extending his hand to Sarah. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, not just for forgiveness, but for showing me a better way. As Sarah prepared to leave the terminal, she saw the changes already taking place. New signs about respect and equality hung on the walls. Security staff underwent training in the conference room. The young girl who had come to meet her was chatting excitedly with Tracy about becoming a doctor. Maria walked Sarah to her car. You know, she said, when you first suggested these changes, I thought we were just fixing the security problem. Now I see we're part of something much bigger. Sarah smiled, thinking about how one difficult morning had sparked such transformation. Sometimes the most profound changes came not from confrontation, but from showing others a path to their better selves. As she drove away, she saw Cooper in her rearview mirror, standing straighter than before, ready to begin his own journey of changing hearts and minds, starting with his own. 3 months had passed since that transformative morning at the private aviation terminal. Sarah pulled up to the familiar building, this time for a different purpose. She wasn't here to catch a flight. She had been invited to speak at the terminal's first graduation ceremony for their comprehensive bias training program. The terminal looked different now. New digital screens displayed messages about equality and respect. A diverse group of security staff moved efficiently through their duties. But the biggest change was in the atmosphere, warm, professional, and genuinely welcoming to everyone. As Sarah walked through the entrance, she saw Thomas Cooper greeting passengers with a natural smile. He was no longer the bitter security guard who had tried to block her path. Instead, he stood confident and composed, wearing a new badge that read Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator. Dr. Mitchell, Cooper called out, his face lighting up. The participants are so excited to meet you. Your story has been the cornerstone of our training program. The conference room where she had once filed her complaint was now set up for the ceremony. 20 security staff members from various terminals across the country sat in rows, their graduation certificates laid out neatly on a table. Maria Torres stepped to the podium. 3 months ago, an incident in this terminal showed us we needed to change. Today, we celebrate not just new protocols, but new perspectives. She gestured to the graduates. Each person here has completed 40 hours of intensive training, led by someone who experienced his own transformation, Mr. Thomas Cooper. Cooper took the stage, standing taller than Sarah had ever seen him. When Dr. Mitchell walked into this terminal that morning, I saw her through the lens of my prejudices. Today, I see every passenger through the lens of respect and dignity. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. Sometimes our greatest teachers are the people we wrong the most. As Sarah listened to the graduates share their stories, she noticed Chief Harris slip into the back of the room. He had flown in from headquarters to witness this milestone. The program they had discussed in Chicago was now being implemented across all private aviation terminals nationwide. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she looked out at the faces before her, faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds, united in their commitment to change. 3 months ago, I walked into this terminal as a neurosurgeon headed to a conference, she began. I didn't expect to become part of a different kind of surgery, one that operates on beliefs rather than brains, on attitudes rather than arteries. She shared how the incident had rippled beyond aviation. Medical institutions had reached out to her about implementing similar training programs. The young girl who had met her that day was now in a medical mentorship program. Even her viral video had become a teaching tool in corporate diversity training across the country. After the ceremony, Cooper approached her with tears in his eyes. "Dr. Mitchell, remember how you told me that recognition is the first step toward change? Well, I've taken many steps since then." He handed her a folder containing feedback from his training sessions. Participants consistently praised his honesty about his own journey from prejudice to awareness. Maria joined them, sharing the latest statistics. Security check times were now consistent across all passengers. Complaint rates had dropped to near zero. Most importantly, passenger surveys showed that everyone felt equally welcomed and respected. "You know what the best part is?" Cooper added. "Last week, my granddaughter asked me why I had acted that way in the video. I was able to tell her about learning and growing, about becoming a better person. She hugged me and said she was proud of her grandpa." As Sarah prepared to leave, she saw a new group of passengers entering the terminal. She watched as Cooper and his team greeted each one with the same professional courtesy. No hesitation, no bias, no difference in treatment. Outside, the same sun that had shone on that difficult morning now illuminated the transformed space. Sarah remembered something she often told her medical students. The brain can create new pathways after injury, rebuilding connections and learning new ways to function. The same was true, she had learned, of human hearts and minds. Driving away from the terminal, Sarah smiled. Sometimes the most important changes didn't happen in operating rooms or conference halls, but in everyday moments when people chose to confront their biases and change their hearts. And sometimes, the most powerful medicine wasn't found in prescriptions or procedures, but in patience, dignity, and the courage to show others a better way.